I swear it was the way she looked at me. Not in that, oh, he's cute kind of way, but like she was seeing a ghost from her past and didn't know whether to run or invite him in. She had this distant calm in her eyes, the kind you get when life's hit you hard and you've stopped flinching. I was halfway through lifting a dusty old bookshelf when she said softly, almost like it wasn't meant for me to hear, "Haven't let a man this close since my husband died." My hands froze. I don't even think I breathed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 2 hours earlier, I had no idea what I was walking into. I'd picked up a last-minute moving gig through a local app, just a side job between other gigs. The listing was vague. Need help moving furniture? Not moving out? Just rearranging, that was it. No details. No address until the booking was confirmed. I didn't think much of it. I just figured it'd be an easy half-day lifting some couches and earning a little extra cash. I've done dozens of these jobs. Usually some retired couple who bought a new recliner, or a young family trying to feng shui their place without throwing out their backs. But this one was different. The second I pulled up, her house sat in one of those old, tree-canopied neighborhoods where everything looked like it belonged in a sepia-toned photo. Porch swings, wind chimes, even a little ceramic frog by the mailbox. It had character, but it also felt ... quiet. Like time had slowed down there and forgotten to pick back up. I parked on the curb, grabbed my gloves, and headed up the brick walkway. The door opened before I could knock twice. "You must be Caleb," she said. Her voice was warm, but there was something in her tone like she was tired of being strong. "Come in. We've got some heavy lifting to do." Her name was Diane. Mid-50s, maybe a bit older, but you'd never guess it unless you looked closely. She had that elegant kind of presence, like the kind of woman who used to be the center of every room but now preferred the corner. Her hair was tied up in one of those loose buns that somehow looked both casual and put together. Barefoot, oversized cardigan slipping off one shoulder. There was a sadness in her posture, but she carried it like a coat she'd learned to live with. She led me into the living room, and it was immediately clear this wasn't just some light redecorating. The place looked like someone had pressed pause halfway through a breakup horror, maybe halfway through healing. Furniture was half covered with sheets, picture frames were stacked against the wall, books scattered in open boxes. It didn't feel like she was moving out. It felt like she was making space. "I want this whole wall cleared out," she said, pointing to an old hutch, a coffee table, and a worn leather couch that looked like it had stories buried in the cushions. That cabinet stays, and the piano, too, but everything else ... Yeah, it can go. "Where to?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Some to storage, some to the garage. Some I haven't decided yet." She looked away when she said that last part. That's when I first sensed it grief, but not fresh grief. It's the kind that had settled in and made itself at home. We started with the hutch. Heavy thing, solid wood. It's a kind of furniture nobody makes anymore. I asked if she had anything delicate inside, and she shook her head. "Already emptied it," she said, then paused. "Well, most of it." She opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a faded photo album. "I should probably hold on to this." She didn't look at the pictures, just tucked it under her arm like a memory. She wasn't ready to relive. We worked mostly in silence after that, not the awkward kind, more like mutual respect. The kind where two people understand that words aren't always necessary. She handed me a glass of water after we got the couch moved. "Break time," she said, nodding toward the front porch. We sat out there for a few minutes, watching the wind play with the leaves. It was quiet, peaceful, but underneath you could feel something brewing, you know? She said suddenly. "This used to be the busiest room in the house." She was staring through the screen door into the living room. Game nights. Movie. Marathons. That's where the kids opened Christmas presents. And now I'm just trying to remember what it feels like to sit there without crying. I didn't know what to say. What do you say to something like that? So I just sat with her. We headed back in and started moving an old bookshelf. That's when she said it. That one line that hit harder than anything I've heard on any job I've done. I haven't let a man this close since my husband died. She wasn't even looking at me when she said, itch, just gripping the edge of the shelf, staring at some invisible spot on the wall. I froze. She didn't seem to expect a response. I think she just needed to say it out loud, like admitting it to someone made it real. That moment, that's when I knew this wasn't going to be just another moving gig. I didn't respond to what she said. Not out loud, anyway. Some things hang too heavy in the air to touch, and that sentence, I haven't let a man this close since my husband died, was one of them. It wasn't a flirtation, not really. It wasn't even a confession. It felt more like she was testing the room, testing herself, to see how it sounded coming out of her mouth. Like saying it would make it easier to accept. We stood there in the middle of her living room. Both of us with our hands on a bookshelf, neither of us was thinking about anymore. And I remember this sharp awareness hitting me. I was now part of something bigger than a job. Something intimate. Something messy. Something fragile. The rest of that day played out with a strange quiet between us, not awkward, it's not cold, just an awareness. A kind of stillness that made everything feel heavier, like the furniture weighed more because of what it represented. I noticed things I hadn't before. The way she touched objects before letting them go. The way her fingers lingered on the edge of an old lamp or a faded cushion. It wasn't just moving things, she was saying goodbye to them. Letting go in slow motion. Every piece we carried out felt like a chapter closing. A drawer emptied. A version of herself boxed up and hauled away. At one point, I was in the garage, stacking a few boxes on top of an old dresser, when I spotted a folded American flag in a display case. It was sitting on a shelf above some gardening tools, slightly dusty, like it hadn't been touched in a while. There was a photo frame next to it, her husband, I guessed. Younger than I expected, tall squared shoulders, a clean uniform, serious face. Probably early 40s in the photo. I didn't ask. Didn't say a word about it. But when she came into the garage a few minutes later, she saw me looking. That was from his memorial, she said quietly, not even pretending to be casual about it. He was deployed twice, made it through both, came home, died of a heart attack 2 years later. Just like that. It's folded laundry in the morning, gone by noon. I nodded. Again, not because I had anything profound to say, but because, what do you even say to something like that? I'm sorry feels like a drop of water in a desert. It doesn't do anything. It's just a placeholder for real comfort, the kind no words can offer. She didn't cry, didn't even blink. She just leaned against the garage doorway and looked at nothing, like her thoughts were running a film reel only she could see. Then she pushed off the wall and said, "We've got 2 more chairs inside." By the time we wrapped up that afternoon, the house looked noticeably different. Not empty, but ... decluttered. Cleansed. Almost like some weight had been lifted. Not all of it, but just enough to make breathing easier. She walked me to the door and handed me an envelope. "Your payment," she said, then added, "and a little extra, for being human." I nodded, thanked her, and turned to leave. But right as I reached the porch steps, she called out, "Are you free next weekend?" Ain't. Turned. "Yeah, I think so. I might need help moving a few more things. No pressure. Just ... If you're free," I said sure. Not because I needed the money, but because I needed to see how this story ended. Or maybe how it continued. Either way, I was invested now. Not in a romantic way, not yet anyway, but in that quiet, subtle way where someone else's. Healing starts to feel like part of your own purpose. Like you're not just showing up to lift things, but to witness something. To hold space for someone else's pain, even if just for a few hours. The week passed slower than usual. I found myself thinking about her more than I expected. Not obsessively, just ... often. Wondering what she was sorting through in that house. What she was holding on to. What she was still afraid to touch. I pictured her walking through the rooms, pausing in doorways, staring at things and remembering. It wasn't attraction that kept my mind returning to her, it was curiosity, empathy, maybe a bit of guilt too. For how easy it is to forget that grief doesn't always look like sobbing. Sometimes it looks like rearranging a room. Sometimes. It sounds like I haven't let a man this close. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Saturday came. Same house, same time, but she looked different. Not younger or older just ... lighter, like someone who'd slept well for the first time in a while. She smiled when she opened the door, and for the first time, it reached her eyes. "Glad you came back," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "I was worried you might think I'm a little too much." "Not at all," I said, walking in. The living room had changed again. A new rug, fewer boxes, candles lit on the windowsill. It didn't look like a house in mourning anymore. It looked like a home trying to remember how to be warm again. She pointed to a stack of small furniture by the dining room. "Those need to go to the attic," she said. "If you don't mind, there's a mirror I want to hang. It's too heavy for me." I followed her down the hallway, and it occurred to me how comfortable I felt in her space already. I'd been coming there for years, and as I climbed the attic stairs with a side table balanced on one shoulder, I realized this wasn't just a job anymore. This was the start of something I didn't have a name for yet. But I was okay with that. The attic was warmer than I expected, a sharp contrast to the coolness of the rest of the house. The air was thick with that familiar old house scent: cardboard, dust, a hint of mothballs, and aged wood. Sunlight slanted in from a small window near the peak of the roof, cutting a golden line across the floorboards. As I set the side table down near a stack of boxes labeled Christmas and Michael's books, I noticed how neat everything was, even up here. This wasn't a place of chaos. It was a museum. A collection of years tucked into corners, preserved, like artifacts. I took a slow breath and realized that while most people stuff their attics full of what they want to forget, Diane had arranged hers like a memory gallery. Coming back down the creaky steps, I passed by a series of framed photos. On the hallway wall, I hadn't really looked at them last time, but now they caught my attention. Family portraits, vacations, Christmas mornings. A few faded Polaroids from what looked like the early 90s. One picture in particular stood out: a beach photo. Her and her husband, and 2 young kids. He was mid-laugh, shirtless with sunglasses. One arm around her shoulder, the other holding a juice box, like he'd just stolen it from one of the kids. She looked so young in that photo, younger than I'd ever seen her in person, carefree. The version of herself before the weight of years settled in. It was the kind of photo you look at and wonder if the people in it knew how fast it was all going to go. She was waiting for me in the hallway, wiping her hands on a dish towel as if she'd just dried dishes she hadn't washed. Her eyes followed mine as they landed on the beach photo. "That was Sanibel Island, summer of '99, she said. "It rained half the time, but it was perfect anyway." Offered a small nod, not asking anything, just listening. "Michael used to chase the kids with seaweed. They'd scream like he was a sea monster. It was ridiculous." She smiled, but it was the kind that only lasts a second before it folds into something sadder. That was before the deployments. Before he came back quieter. We moved into the dining room next. She had a heavy oak-framed mirror she wanted hung above the buffet table. It was the kind of mirror that made the whole room feel like it was watching you, the type that belonged in a place where people used to host parties. We measured and marked and drilled, but I noticed she wasn't really paying attention to the process. Her hands were fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve, twisting the fabric between her fingers like she needed something to hold on to. I could tell her mind was somewhere else, somewhere farther away than the attic, somewhere she hadn't let herself visit in a while. When the mirror was finally up, she stood back and stared at it for a long time. Her reflection looked tired but proud, like a woman who had climbed out of something no one else had seen. "Always wanted it here," she murmured, more to herself than to me. But I thought it was too much. Too formal now it feels. Right, the sentence hung there, heavy with implication. Like she was finally letting his decisions back into the house after years of pushing them out. I didn't say a word. I just stood beside her, our reflections side by side, both of us staring at ghosts. Afterward, we sat in the kitchen, sipping coffee. She brewed it strong with a splash of cream and something I couldn't place. Maybe cinnamon, maybe nutmeg. Whatever it was It felt homemade. The kitchen felt warmer than the rest of the house, like it was the one room that had been allowed to keep its memories intact. The refrigerator was still plastered with old magnets, faded recipes, photos held up by little paw-print clips. Sticky note on the freezer door read, "Pick up more basil, though," from the look of the spice rack. She hadn't cooked for more than one person in a long time. She talked more this time, not about the past, but about the now. How she'd been teaching art classes at the community center. How she'd started taking walks in the evening again. "I don't talk to many people," she admitted, stirring her coffee slowly. "Not because I don't want to. I just don't know how anymore. It's like I forgot how to be a version of myself that doesn't revolve around someone else." She didn't look at me when she said it, but the words hit square. It was the kind of thing people don't usually say unless they've already said it to themselves 100 times. I nodded, more than once. Not out of politeness, but because I recognized it. That feeling of drifting, not being the main character in your own life. You don't have to be widowed to understand loss. Sometimes the person you lose is yourself. And maybe that's what made her house feel so familiar. Not just the sadness, but the searching. The trying. The quiet effort of rebuilding an identity, brick by brick, after everything has crumbled. The afternoon sun filtered in through the blinds, casting soft lines across the countertop. We didn't say much after that. There wasn't a need. Some silences are uncomfortable. Others feel earned. This was the latter. Silence that said we'd crossed an invisible line. That something had shifted, not in a romantic sense, not yet, but in a human one. We weren't just mover and client anymore. We were two people carrying weight the other couldn't see. And somehow, for a few hours every Saturday, it felt lighter. Before I left that day, she handed me a wrapped plate of cookies. Homemade, still warm. "You didn't ask for these," she said, placing them in my hands, "but something told me you'd appreciate them." I smiled, thanked her, and started to turn toward the door. Then she added, "Same time next week?" Her voice held less hesitation this time, like she wasn't just asking about moving boxes anymore. "Yeah," I said, "I'll be here." I arrived a little early the next Saturday, not because I was eager, but because something in me felt pulled to the place. Like the house itself had started to take root in my routine. There was comfort in its stillness, in the way the porch creaked under my boots and the smell of pine mulch lining the garden path she'd recently cleaned up. The front door was already open a crack when I walked up, like she'd been waiting or had sensed I was coming. I knocked lightly anyway, more out of habit than necessity. She called from inside. "Come in, it's open," and when I stepped in, the scent of cinnamon hit me first, followed by the low hum of jazz playing softly from a speaker tucked behind the bookshelves. The house looked different again. She had moved the armchair to face the window, added throw pillows in a color I hadn't seen before, mustard yellow, warm and unexpected. There was a new plant on the side table, its leaves glossy and green, and it felt like the house had taken one more deep breath, like it had stretched a little further toward life. She appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a cloth, smiling a little like she'd been caught mid-thought. "I made muffins," she said, motioning toward a small plate on the counter. "They're probably too sweet, but I figured if we're lifting heavy things again, we might as well have something worth lifting for." I gave a small laugh, and we sat for a moment at the kitchen bar, each grabbing one. They were blueberry, and even if they'd been awful, I wouldn't have said a word. But they weren't. They were soft in the middle, crisp at the top, like she'd been baking them her whole life. After a few quiet minutes, she gestured toward a narrow hallway I hadn't been through before. "Today's project is the back room," she said. "It used to be Michael's office." Her voice faltered just slightly on his name, but she kept walking. "I haven't touched it not since." The back room was small, maybe 10 feet by 12, and the air inside was cooler, like it had been shut away from the rest of the house for too long. Dust floated in thin beams of sunlight through half-closed blinds. The tall bookcase stretched across one wall, still filled with hardcover biographies, legal pads, a few unopened mail envelopes. A desk sat under the window, its surface cluttered with pens, paperweights, a photo of him in uniform, and a half-burned candle that hadn't been lit in years. I stood in the doorway for a second before stepping inside, sensing that this space wasn't just another room, it was a memory sealed in drywall and silence. "I don't know what I want to do with it," she said behind me. "Part of me wants to leave it. Another part wants to turn it into something else. Something mine." She paused. "He used to spend hours in here, writing, thinking, organizing, God knows what. I never really understood what he did in here, but he said it helped him feel in control." Her voice trailed off, and she began opening drawers, not quickly, just lifting papers, flipping pages, touching things she hadn't in a long time. "I kept pretending I'd clean it out eventually," she said softly, "but every time I opened the door, it felt like I was erasing him. I didn't move. I didn't offer any suggestion. I just stood there, quietly absorbing the weight of what this room meant. People talk a lot about grief like it's a wave, something that comes and crashes, then recedes. But this was different. This was sediment, layered, settled, quiet, grief that had unpacked its bags and made itself a tenant. We started slowly emptying the drawers, stacking books, collecting loose items into boxes she labeled herself. Not everything went into storage. Some things she threw away, broken pen, old receipts, worn-out notebooks filled with chicken scratch. But some things she hesitated on, holding them up to the light like they might speak. A tie still knotted, a wristwatch with a dead battery, a tiny clay sculpture that looked like a child's attempt at an animal, maybe a dog, maybe a bear. "Our son made this in kindergarten," she whispered. "Michael kept it on his desk like it was priceless." She set it gently in a box marked "Keep." By midday, we had cleared enough space to see the floor and open the window. Light poured in like it hadn't in years, illuminating dust-covered corners, casting sharp shadows against the pale blue carpet. She stood in the center of the room and looked around, arms crossed, lips pressed together. "I didn't think I could do this," she said. "I thought I'd fall apart, but I'm okay." She said it like she was still trying to convince herself. That afternoon, something changed between us. Not anything dramatic. No dramatic stares, no lingering touches, just an unspoken trust. She didn't explain everything she felt, and I didn't ask. But we both knew that space had been made, not just in the room, but in her, and maybe a little in me, too. I'd been going through my own version of drifting for years now. Jobs, couch surfing, quiet mornings with no plans. And here in this house, helping a woman I barely knew carry pieces of her past from one room to another. I felt more grounded than I had in months. As I was gathering my tools at the end of the UA day, she asked if I wanted to stay for dinner. Just like that. No preamble, no awkwardness. "It's just leftovers," she said. "Roast chicken. I made too much. And well, it feels strange eating alone after a day like this." I hesitated. Not because I didn't want to, but because part of me wondered if accepting would change something, shift the balance. But I nodded. "Sure," I said. "Sounds good." We sat at the small kitchen table, plates between us, the kind of meal that didn't need to be explained or dressed up. No candles, no fancy presentation, just warm food and the quiet clink of forks on ceramic. At one point, she laughed shrilly. Laughed at something I said about a moving job gone wrong last year, and the sound of it caught me off guard. It was light, unguarded, like something that hadn't escaped her in years. And when I left that evening, she walked me to the porch again. The sky was turning orange at the edges, the kind of summer sunset that makes everything feel suspended. In amber. She didn't say much, just leaned on the doorframe and watched me go. But as I reached the sidewalk, she called out, voice soft but certain. "Same time next week?" This time I didn't even pause. "Yeah," I said. "I'll be." Here the following Saturday arrived with a thick gray sky and a cool breeze that threatened rain. It didn't bother me. In fact, it felt fitting, like the weather had decided to slow everything down with us. Diane's house looked softer in the overcast light. Less contrast, more quiet. I parked in the same spot on the street, walked the Same path past her blooming hydrangeas, and knocked, even though I knew by now she'd leave the door open. Sure enough, it creaked slightly ajar. Her voice came from the kitchen, warm and familiar. "Come on in, I'm making tea." The smell of something earthy and sweet filled the air, maybe ginger, maybe something floral. The jazz music was gone today, replaced by the low murmur of a talk radio show coming from an old countertop speaker. She greeted me without formality, like I was a regular guest now, not someone she'd only known a few weeks. There was a comfort in the rhythm that had built between us. She handed me a mug chipped around the rim but clean-handed. We sat at the kitchen bar again, sipping in silence. The tea was strong and unfamiliar, but it warmed me from the inside. "I was thinking we could tackle the guest bedroom today," she said, not looking at me, but into her mug. "It's not as... emotional, I promise." I nodded, not because I believed her, but because I understood what she meant. The guest room wasn't about grief, not directly. But in a house that had once been full, any room left untouched for years starts to carry its own quiet kind of ache. I followed her down the hallway, the one that had become increasingly familiar, and we paused in front of a closed door. She opened it slowly, like she wasn't sure what we'd find on the other side. The room was tidy in that strange way abandoned. Spaces often are. The bed was made, corners sharp. A bookshelf sat untouched, filled with young adult novels and old travel guides. On the wall hung a faded poster of some European cityscape, and in the corner, a small wooden desk held a closed laptop covered in dust. There were no signs of use, no cluttered, just stillness, a preserved moment. "My daughter used to stay here when she visited from college," she said, brushing her hand across the surface of the desk. "She moved to Seattle a few years ago, got a job in publishing, met someone. Life happened, but it didn't reach her eyes. We talk, of course, but it's not the same. You spend their whole childhood building this nest, and then they grow wings you're not invited to see in flight." She looked at me then, directly. "You have kids?" I shook my head. "No," I said simply, and she nodded like that answer told her something important, even if neither of us knew exactly what. We started clearing out the closet boxes of old blankets, forgotten clothes, and storage bins labeled with years. I lifted one that simply said 2015 in black marker and passed it to her. She opened it slowly and pulled out a folded graduation gown, a pair of ballet slippers, and a stack of photo booth pictures clipped together with a rusted paper clip. She danced until she was 17. She said more to herself than to me. Hated it by the end. But I made her keep going, I thought. I thought she'd thank me later. She stared at the slippers in her hands like they might somehow explain themselves, then set them gently back in the box and closed the lid. We stacked a few things to be donated, a few to be kept, and left the rest for another time. I could tell she was already getting tired, but she didn't want to stop. She was trying to finish something she hadn't been ready to start until... Now we took a break after a couple hours back in the kitchen, where the radio had shifted to soft instrumental music, and the tea had gone cold in our mugs. I offered to brew a fresh pot, and she smiled, handing me a different bag, this time something citrusy and bright. "I'm learning to let go of the idea that everything has to stay the same," she said as I poured the water. "It's a slow lesson, but it's happening." We sat across from each other at the table. The light through the kitchen window was muted by clouds, and for a moment, it felt like the house was floating outside of time. She told me more about her daughter, funny stories from her teenage years, memories that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with living. We laughed over one about a disastrous homecoming dance, a crooked corsage, a boy who wore too much cologne. And in that laughter, I saw her again, not the widow, not the woman sorting through her past, but just Diane, human, whole, still in there. Beneath all the layers of loss, I don't know how long we sat there talking, but eventually, the conversation slowed and she looked down at her hands folded on the table. "Sometimes I wonder," she said softly, "if I've spent so long being sad that I forgot how to be anything else." She didn't cry. She didn't even blink. But the way she said Ite stayed with me, like it had been waiting to be said, and now that it had, there was no taking it back. Before I left that day, she walked me to the door as always. But this time, she stepped outside with me, barefoot on the front porch, the wind gently moving. Her hair. "Next week," she said, looking out at the street, "I think I want to work on the garden. It's overgrown. Michael used to take care of it." She glanced back at me. "It's time I learned." "Okay," I said. "I'll bring gloves." She smiled, not a big one, but the kind that lasts a second longer than usual. Land nodded. "Same time? Same time?" Out. I walked away feeling something different. Not lighter, not heavier dash, just dot. Like her story had somehow made room for mine, and we were both in the middle of writing something neither of us had planned. And maybe, just maybe, we were doing it together. The garden was worse than I expected, not in a hopeless wage, just in that quiet kind of neglect that sneaks up on a place. Weeds had woven themselves into the flower beds like they belonged there. Vines climbed up the porch railing, and the one straight line of boxwoods that flanked the walkway had gone crooked with time and weather. It wasn't ruined, not by any means, but it looked forgotten, like a chapter someone skipped and never went back to read. Diane stood in the doorway, gardening gloves in one hand, a sun hat slung low over her eyes. "It used to be beautiful," she said, not apologetically, just matter dash of dash fact. We started near the mailbox, working our way inward. She showed me where the roses used to bloom and pointed out which herbs might still be hiding under the mess. I brought a couple hand tools and gloves like I had promised, and we got to work. Pulling weeds, cutting back branches, digging our fingers into the soil. There was something therapeutic about it. Something real. It's a kind of work that lets your mind wander without leaving you completely. We didn't talk much in the beginning, just let the sound of digging and rustling and birds overhead fill the silence. After a while, she stood up straight, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her glove, and said, "He used to spend hours out here," said it helped him think. She looked down at a half-dug flower bed, then over at me. "I used to tease him for it," said he was escaping the noise inside. "Maybe he was." Her voice didn't carry bitterness, just observation. Like she was still unpacking what all those afternoons meant. Funny how the things that used to irritate us, become the things we miss the most. There was a pause, long enough for a breeze to pass through the trees and shake loose a few dry leaves from a nearby oak. I kept digging, not because I was trying to avoid eye contact, but because something about working side by side like this made everything feel easier, less pressured. Like we didn't have to look directly at the pain to feel it. We uncovered more than weeds that day. Beneath a collapsed section of trellis, she found a broken bird feeder that Michael had built by hand. "He made this when the kids were little," she said, brushing dirt from the wood. Said every garden should have something to take care of. She didn't put it aside or toss it out. She placed it gently on the porch, like maybe it could be fixed, like maybe it still had a place. As we moved to the side yard, where the ground sloped slightly and the grass grew in uneven patches, she started talking more. About the early years, about the house when it was new. "We planted everything ourselves," she said, motioning toward a now wild cluster of azaleas. "Didn't have the money to hire anyone, so we just bought things one Saturday and figured it out." She laughed softly. We read gardening books like they were religious texts. I just picked what looked pretty. Her face softened as she said it, and for a moment, I saw the younger version of her in that smile. The newlywed, the hopeful, the woman who thought life had a predictable rhythm. Eventually, we reached the corner of the yard, where a stone bench sat under a lopsided crepe. Myrtle. The bench was cracked along the middle, moss curling around its base, but it still looked sturdy. She brushed it off and sat down with a sigh, motioning for me to do the same. We drank water from a cooler I'd brought and let the sweat dry. On our skin, the sun peeked through the clouds just enough to throw soft light across her face. She looked content. Tired, but content. "I think this is the first time the garden's felt alive in years," she said. "Not just cleaned, but alive." I nodded, sipping from my bottle, letting the moment settle around us. There's a specific kind of silence that only happens in a backyard. It's different from the kitchen quiet or the stillness of a hallway. It's natural, open, forgiving. And in that silence, she said something I hadn't expected. Sometimes I wonder if I kept the yard messy on purpose, so it would match how I felt inside. She didn't look at me when she said it. She just stared out toward the overgrown fence line, eyes steady. I let the weight of her words sink in before I responded, not with anything grand or poetic, but with honesty. I think a lot of us do that. Let the outside fall apart so we don't have to admit we already feel broken. She nodded slowly. Lips pressed together, and for the first time I felt the kind of closeness that didn't need touch or titles. Just presence. Just being there. She didn't cry. I didn't offer comfort. We just sat. Two people under a crepe myrtle, dirty gloves and all. Taking a breath between what had been and what might still be, we packed up an hour later, the garden looking half-finished but more alive than when we started. She thanked me, as always. But this time, there was something different in the way she said it. Not just for the work, but for being there, for showing up. For not rushing the process she couldn't name. As I walked back to my truck, she followed me halfway down the porch steps. Next week, she called out, voice lighter than I'd heard it in days. I might need help in the garage. If you're up for it, I turned around, met her eyes, and smiled. Of course, I said. Same time, she grinned and nodded. Same time. And as I pulled away, watching her in the rearview mirror, standing on the edge of that porch with dirt on her hands and sunlight on her face, realized I was looking forward to next week more than I had anything in a long, long time. The garage was its own kind of time capsule, not in the way of old relics or antique tools, but in the quiet accumulation of the everyday. Stacks of things meant to be sorted later, half-used cans of paint lined up like memories, paused mid-thought. Shelves burdened by holiday decorations, cords, screws, half-fixed appliances. The air was stale with dust and engine oil. Diane opened the side door with both hands, almost like it was a ceremony, and stood for a moment just staring inside. I used to hate this place, she said, brushing her palm along the peeling. Paint of the frame, but it was his domain, so I let it be. We stepped into the space together. It was dim, the single bulb overhead flickering like it wasn't quite ready to come back to life. She moved slowly, eyes scanning every surface, every corner. There was a workbench in the back, cluttered but organized in its own way. Jars of nails, labeled in fading Sharpie. A roll of duct tape mounted on the wall like a trophy. One of those old red metal tool chests with drawers that stuck a little when you tried to pull them. I got the sense she hadn't touched any of it, not since he passed. Maybe even before that. She stood near the bench, not moving, her arms wrapped around herself. He'd spend hours in here. Sometimes I didn't even know what he was working on. Just hammering, measuring, rearranging things that didn't need rearranging. She gave a soft laugh that didn't quite lift. I used to think he came out here to avoid me. Maybe sometimes he did. But mostly, I think he needed it. A space that didn't ask him to be anything but useful. That word useful. In the air longer than I expected. Maybe because I'd felt that too. The aching need to be needed. To prove your worth by what your hands could fix. I didn't say anything, just started clearing the near wall, moving stacked bins and dust-covered boxes into a neat pile on the driveway. She joined me a moment later, quietly sifting through a tub of old extension cords and tangled Christmas lights. For every one she tossed, she kept another, holding it up like a question she wasn't sure how to answer. We worked in a slow rhythm, unspoken but synchronized. Every now and then, she'd pull something from a shelf, a pair of gloves, a rusted wrench, a photo tucked behind a calendar from 2014, and pause before deciding its fate. At one point, she found a stack of letters in a worn shoebox and didn't open them. She stared at the box for a long time, then slid it into a tote labeled keep without a word. I didn't ask. That silence said everything. Midway through the afternoon, she found a small radio tucked in a corner, still plugged in. Its cord looped around a nail like someone had once planned to come back and play it again. She dusted it off and turned the dial, and to both our surprise, it still worked. A scratchy oldie station came through a Welvis, or something close to it. She smiled, a genuine one this time, and left it playing while we kept sorting, that small. soundtrack changed the tone of everything. The dust didn't feel as heavy. The cobwebs seemed easier to clear. We moved through the space with a little more lightness, even laughter here and there. She found an old dartboard he used to swear he'd hang one day. I found a broken wind chime tangled with fishing line. She joked about how he never fished, not even once, but kept that line like it was sacred. He just liked having it, she said. Said you never know when you'll need to reel something in. Something about the way she said that made both of us pause. The line, the metaphor, maybe accidental. By the time the sun dipped lower in the sky, the garage looked different. Not finished, but better. Breathing again. We had cleared half the floor, reorganized the wall shelves, and stacked what she wanted to keep on one side in tidy labeled containers. It still looked like a garage, but it didn't feel like a shrine anymore. It felt like space with potential. Something in her posture shifted too. Shoulders relaxed. Eyes not darting so much. She looked around and said, I didn't think I could do this. I really didn't. You did, I said. Not to comfort her, but because it was true. She leaned against the open frame of the garage door, the sky turning a pale orange above us. The light touched her hair, made her look softer, more present. I've been holding on to this idea that if I keep everything the same, nothing will really be gone, she said. Like if I keep his jacket on the hook or his boots in the corner, then I'm not alone. But that's not real, is it? She didn't wait for an answer. It's just grief, dressing up his memory. That line cut deep, not just for her, but for something in me too. I thought about the things I'd kept, the places I hadn't gone back to, the voices I still heard in quiet moments. I thought about the silence I filled with work and the way I'd convinced myself I liked being rootless. Maybe we were more alike than I had realized. We sat on the porch again when it was over, no tea this time, just water, and the quiet sound of the radio still playing faintly from inside the garage. She didn't say much. Neither did I, but her leg brushed against mine for a moment, not intentional, not even prolonged, but enough to notice. Enough to make the silence feel a little warmer than usual. As I got up to leave, she stood with me. No question about next week this time. No scheduling. She just looked at me and said, thank you. But it wasn't just for the boxers. The cleaning, it was layered. It meant for the time, for the space, for not rushing me through this. And as I walked down the path, passing the garden we'd worked on the week before, I realized how much the place had changed in just a few weeks. Not just the house, but her. And maybe me too. The next time I came by, there was no talk of projects, no boxes waiting, no furniture pulled from corners. The garage door was closed, the tools were tucked away, and the house felt unusually quiet even. For her place, I knocked out of habit, even though the rhythm of our routine had long since made that unnecessary. She opened the door with a kind of softness I hadn't seen before. No makeup, no sweater, just a loose tee and jeans, bare feet on the hardwood floor. I didn't plan anything today, she said, almost apologetically. I hope that's okay. I told her it was more than okay, and it was. Something about the stillness of the air, the absence of tasks, felt like the natural next chapter. Not a pause in the story, but a change in its tempo. We sat in the living room, sunlight pouring through the clean windows, the scent of lavender, drifting faintly from a candle she'd lit without even thinking. There was no music playing, no TV humming in the background. Just us, in the quiet of a house that had finally started to breathe again. She brought out coffee this time, strong and black, and handed it to me without ceremony. I woke up this morning and just didn't want to clean anything. She said, sitting across from me, didn't want to sort or lift or organize. I just wanted to be still. She looked down into her mug like the swirl of coffee might explain something. And I realized, that's new for me. It hit me then how far she'd come. When I first arrived on that porch, she'd been in motion, constantly cleaning, planning, explaining. Every corner of her house told a story she wasn't ready to read, so she stayed busy enough to avoid the plot. But now, here she was, letting the dust settle without panic, letting the silence return without trying to fill it. She was beginning to inhabit her space, not just the house, but her life. We spent the first hour just talking. Not about grief, not about her husband or the rooms we'd cleared, but about things people talk about when they're not trying to be brave. She asked about my past, where I grew up, what my parents did, whether I believed in second chances. I found myself telling her things I hadn't shared with anyone in a while. Not because I needed to unburden, but because it felt safe. Like, her house had become a place where honesty could live. She listened, really listened. Not the way people do when they're waiting to speak, but with her whole attention. At one point I mentioned how I drifted from job to job, never settling, always telling myself I liked the freedom. And she just nodded and said, "Sometimes the story we tell ourselves is the only way we survive the part we're in." It was a simple sentence, but it felt like she'd cracked something open in me. Something I hadn't named yet. By midday, we were both hungry, and she offered to make something light. I offered to help, and she accepted not, out of politeness. But with a kind of ease that spoke to how far our dynamic had shifted. We moved around the kitchen like we'd done it 100 times. Cutting vegetables, slicing bread, boiling pasta. It was unremarkable in the way all the most meaningful things are quiet, collaborative, grounded in presence. We ate on the back patio, a small concrete space tucked behind the house, shaded by an old umbrella and surrounded by flower pots she'd only recently replanted. The sound of wind rustling through leaves, mixed with the occasional chirp of a bird or distant hum of a neighbor's lawnmower. She told me about the first dinner she and Michael had hosted back here, how the grill flared up and singed his eyebrows, how they'd laughed until they cried. And then, with a deep breath, she said, "I haven't sat back here in 3 years. Not once." I didn't respond right away. There was no need to. The weight of that moment didn't require commentary, just witness. She ran her fingers along the edge of her plate and looked out at the yard, eyes tracing the lines of the fence, the garden, the spot under the oak tree where the bird feeder now hung again, whole. "It's strange," she said quietly, "how a space can hold so much without changing shape." That stuck with me. Looked around, seeing what she saw. The physical structure of her world had stayed the same, but the meaning had shifted entirely. What was once frozen had begun to thaw. Not in dramatic floods, but in slow, quiet drips each visit, each memory faced. Each story told like water seeping into dry ground. After lunch, we didn't do much. She showed me a few photo albums, not with any grand narrative in mind, just flipping pages and pointing things out here and there. "That was our road trip to Maine," she said, tapping a faded image of the two of them in front of a lighthouse. "We fought the entire drive, then spent 3 hours in silence, staring at the ocean. It was one of my favorite days. There were stories like that in every picture, real ones. Not all happy, not all painful, it's just life captured." Mid-moment, it felt like I was being led into the most sacred parts of her memory, not as a guest, but as someone who'd earned their way inside by simply staying, by not leaving when it got uncomfortable, by showing up each week with no promise of what was next. Eventually, the afternoon light began to shift, and I stood to go. She didn't walk me to the door this time. Instead, she followed me to the porch, barefoot again, arms crossed lightly over her chest. "I didn't think today would be anything," she said, "but it was. Something." She paused. "Thank you for showing up, even when there's nothing to carry." I nodded, meeting her eyes. "There's always something to carry," I said. "Sometimes it's just not made of wood or steel." She didn't respond. It just gave me a small, knowing smile that said more than words ever could. And as I walked to my truck, I realized that not every weight we lift is visible. Some are felt only in the silence that follows a moment like that, when everything's still. You feel deep down that something has shifted. And in her house, in her life, and maybe in mine, something had. The next Saturday, I arrived. Little later than usual, not by much, maybe 20 minutes, but it felt different. Like we'd quietly crossed the threshold from scheduled appointments into something more fluid, more human. Diane didn't meet me at the door this time. She was in the kitchen, standing barefoot on the tile, focused on stirring something on the stove. The back door had been left open, letting in the breeze. The scent of rosemary and something faintly citrusy drifting through the air. She didn't turn when I stepped in. but I could tell she knew it was me by the way her posture shifted slightly. Shoulders relaxing, her head tilting just enough to acknowledge my presence. "I made soup," she said simply. "Felt like a soup." Day. It was early fall by then. The air had turned, the sun didn't hit as hard, and the trees had begun to dull, just slightly at the edges. That golden stretch of the year, when everything seems to exhale. It matched the energy in her home, a softness, a slowness that felt earned. There wasn't any discussion of work to be done, no mention of rooms to sort or shelves to clear. Just 2 bowls placed on the small kitchen table, 2 glasses of water, and a folded dish towel between us as a napkin. We ate mostly in silence. The soup was thick and hearty, with bits of potato and carrot, and something deeper like time itself had been an ingredient. She didn't ask how I was, and I didn't ask her either. We didn't need to. The quiet between us had become its own kind of conversation. After a while, she set her spoon down, leaned back slightly in her chair, and stared out the window. "I used to hate silence," she said. "It felt like punishment. Now I think it's the only place where anything real can breathe." I knew exactly what she meant. We're taught to fill space to keep the air busy with words, gestures, noise. But there in her kitchen, with the wind rustling the trees outside and the smell of slow-cooked broth lingering between us, the silence felt sacred, like something you protect, not escape. After lunch, she asked if I wanted to take a walk. There was a park a few blocks over, she said, a path she used to walk when she needed to clear her head. "I haven't been in a while," she added.
Not
Since ... Well, not since everything changed. We set off down the street, the sound of leaves crunching faintly beneath our steps. It was a quiet neighborhood, the kind where houses had names and porches told stories. Kids' bikes leaned against fences, wind chimes clinked lazily in the wind, and an old Labrador watched us pass from behind a gate, his eyes following with lazy curiosity. Diane walked slowly, deliberately, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her sweater. I stayed half a step behind, not out of politeness, but because it felt right. Like she was leading us somewhere she hadn't been in years, even if the path itself was familiar. The park was modest, just a narrow gravel loop around a pond, a few benches, and a couple of swings that creaked when the wind picked up. We didn't sit, just walked, letting the rhythm of our steps guide the conversation. She told me about the first time she came here after Michael passed. "I sat on that bench over there," she said, nodding toward the far corner, "and cried until I couldn't breathe. I don't even know why I came. I guess I needed a place to fall apart. That didn't have his coffee mug in it." Her voice didn't crack when she said it. She didn't falter. She just offered it up like a stone from her pocket, something heavy, worn, and long overdue to be put down. We kept walking, the path looping us back toward where we started. We rounded the final curve. She asked, almost casually, "Do you ever feel like you're just waiting for your life to start again?" The question hit harder than I expected. I didn't answer right away. I didn't need to. She looked at me and nodded, as if I had said yes out loud. "I think that's the hardest part," she continued. "The not knowing if the quiet means healing, or if it just means you've stopped trying." Back at the house, we didn't go inside right away. We sat on the front steps, watching the clouds drift overhead in slow, deliberate formations. The soup still sat warm in my stomach, but it was the conversation that had settled into me more deeply. She leaned slightly into her knees, arms wrapped around her shins, like a child might sit when waiting for something they don't know how to name. "I used to think grief had a finish line," she said. "Like if I checked enough boxes, went to therapy, got rid of his clothes, redecorated the bedroom, it would just ... end. But it doesn't. It just gets quieter, sneakier. It hides in the corners until something like a song or a smell brings it roaring back." I didn't try to offer comfort. That was the thing with Diane. She didn't want fixing. She just wanted witness. Maybe that was the only real kind of help we can give another person. Not advice, not solutions, just presence. The sun started to dip behind the rooftops, stretching shadows across the lawn. I stood to leave, brushing off my jeans, and she stood too. For the first time, she walked with me all the way to my truck. It wasn't a long walk, but it felt meaningful, like some invisible distance between us had shortened. Say same time next week. She didn't have to. That understanding now lived in the space between us. It was unspoken but solid. As I drove away, I glanced once in the mirror. She was still standing there, arms folded, sweater tugged close, watching the truck until it turned the corner, and in that moment, something shifted, not in some cinematic love story way, but in the quiet architecture of trust. A kind of gravity had formed between us. A shared space where two people neither trying to be saved, neither trying to save, simply allowed themselves to be seen. When I arrived the next weekend, I found her in the driveway. She was crouched beside one of the front garden beds, tugging gently at a stubborn root, her hair pulled back in a loose bun that let strands fall around her face in soft, accidental patterns. She looked up when I approached, her face flushed with effort and sunlight, and smiled without standing. "Thought I'd get a head start," she said. "Felt restless this morning." There was something different in her energy that day. Not anxious. Not hurried, just ... charged. Like something inside her had started moving again and hadn't quite decided where to go yet. I grabbed a pair of gloves from the passenger seat of my truck and joined her in the garden. We didn't talk. For a while, just worked side by side, pulling weeds, clearing out overgrowth, turning soil. The kind of work that doesn't demand conversation, but always invites it. Eventually. She sat back on her heels and wiped her brow with the back of her wrist. "You know what I miss?" she asked, not looking at me. "I miss being asked how. I'm really doing and knowing the person asking actually wants the truth." She said it so casually it might have slipped past if I hadn't been listening closely, but I heard it. I felt it, that weight she still carried. Even on lighter days, "I've been asked how I'm doing probably 1,000 times since Michael died," she continued, her voice soft. "And every time I say I'm fine, even when I'm not, especially when I'm not. Because people don't actually want to hear that you sat on the bathroom floor for an hour yesterday, because you couldn't remember how to start your day without someone else in it." I stayed quiet. There was nothing to fix, nothing to smooth over. She wasn't handing me a problem, just offering me a truth. That kind of honesty doesn't ask for comfort, it just asks to be heard. We went back to the garden work after that, her pace slowing, her movements more thoughtful. I could tell the words had left her a little raw. That kind of confession always does. But still, she kept moving, kept digging into the dirt like something was buried there that she couldn't quite name. Later, we sat on the porch steps with lemonade. She made it herself, fresh squeezed, with slices of mint from a pot sheet. Kept near the back door. The kind of small detail you don't notice until it's handed to you in a glass, cold and intentional. The sun had started to dip toward the west, and the shadows stretched longer across the lawn. The wind picked up just enough to rustle the leaves and cool the sweat on our necks. "Michael used to say the porch was his favorite part of the house," she said, staring out at the yard. "Said it was the one place where nothing was expected of him.
Oh.
No phone calls, no responsibilities, just a glass of something cold and enough quiet to hear himself think." She took a sip of her lemonade and smiled. I didn't get it then. I do now. I thought about that for a while after she said it. About how we all need places that let us be undone for a moment. Places that don't ask us to perform, to produce, to be useful, just to be. And maybe that's what this had become. For her at this porch, this slow process of clearing out the house, this weekly rhythm with me showing up at her door, a place where she could just be. We moved inside as the light began to fade. She turned on the small lamp in the corner of the living room, the one with the soft yellow glow that made the room feel warmer than it was. She didn't offer dinner. That time, didn't ask if I wanted to stay longer. She just sat on the couch, her legs curled beneath her, and patted the cushion beside her. I hesitated for a moment, not because I was unsure, but because it felt like something was shifting between us, and I wanted to respect the shape it was taking. I sat down, not too close, not too far, just enough to feel the air between us tighten. A little. We didn't touch, didn't even look at each other for a few minutes. Just sat there, listening to the ticking of the old wall clock, the occasional creak of the house settling around us. And in that quiet I felt something I hadn't. In a long time, peace, not from escape, but from connection, from presence, from two people existing in the same space with no need to explain why. Eventually, she spoke again, voice lower now. Do you ever feel like the person you were died with someone else? She didn't wait for me to answer. I do, I think. The version of me that existed when Michael was alive. She's gone. I don't know who I am now. Not really. She paused. But I'm starting to think maybe that's okay. It was the first time I'd heard her speak about herself in the present tense without attaching it to a loss. And it felt significant. Like a door opening. Like the first breeze through a window that had been stuck shut for too long. She didn't cry. Neither did I, but something in the room softened, like we both let go of some invisible rope we'd been gripping too tightly. When I stood to leave, she didn't follow me to the door. She stayed on the couch, legs still tucked beneath her, eyes calm. But just before I reached for the handle, she said, "Hey." I turned. "Thanks for not needing me to be anything." I nodded, not trusting myself to say much more. "See you next week," she smiled then. A small one, but real. Same time. There was a chill in the air when I pulled up that Saturday, not biting, not uncomfortable, just enough to remind you that fall was officially here and summer was. Something you could only feel now in the residual warmth of memory. The leaves had begun to turn for real this time. Yellows and reds creeping into the trees like whispers of time moving forward whether we noticed or not. Diane was already outside when I arrived, sitting on the edge of the porch in a sweater. Twice her size, sipping coffee from a thermos, like it was a ritual. She waved without standing. Her other hand tucked beneath the oversized sleeves, and I joined her on the porch without a word. There was a blanket bunched beside her, and she unfolded it as I sat, draping it over both our laps like it was the most natural thing in the world. We didn't speak for a while, just watched the neighborhood go about its quiet rhythm and old. Man walking a dog down the opposite sidewalk, the sound of a rake dragging across pavement somewhere down the block. Wind teasing the last stubborn leaves on a naked branch. I was thinking, she said finally, about how long it takes to feel like yourself again after everything changes. Her voice wasn't heavy with sadness like it used to be. It was curious now, more reflective than wounded. And not the old version of yourself, but someone new. Someone who remembers what joy felt like, but doesn't rely on the past to find it again. I nodded, not out of agreement, but understanding. There's a difference. Sometimes people don't need you to confirm what they're feeling. They just need to know someone else sees it. She glanced sideways at me then, the rim of the thermos. Resting against her bottom lip. "You've been a quiet constant," she said. "I don't think I've had one of those in a long time." The words hit me harder than I expected. Not because they were romantic, they weren't, but because they were true. I hadn't planned on becoming anything in her life. I hadn't planned on becoming part of her story. There I was, woven into the fabric of her healing, stitch by slow stitch, without ever needing to announce myself. Just by being there. She stood after a while, stretching her legs with a soft groan, and asked if I'd help her bring something down from the attic. "It's not heavy," she added quickly, "just awkward. And I don't want to do it alone." The way she said that last part carried more weight than the item probably did. We climbed the attic stairs together, the floorboards creaking beneath our steps. The light up there was always a little dim, like the space resisted clarity. She led me to a box tucked behind some holiday storage bins and pointed to it. It was labeled Diane before. I looked at her, eyebrows raised slightly, but she just smiled and shrugged. That's what I called it when I packed it up. It's stuff from before Michael, before the kids, before ... everything. I carried the box downstairs with both hands, and we brought it into the living room. She didn't open it right away. Just stared at it like it might open on its own. Then, slowly, she knelt down and pulled back the flaps. Inside were pieces of a life she hadn't touched in decades-old journals. Faded photographs of her as a teenager, college notebooks filled with scribbled ideas, a scarf with a small tear at the edge, a playbill from a show she once performed. I used to act," she said, her fingers brushing the corner of the playbill. "Community theater, nothing big. but I loved it. I felt alive on stage. It's like I could be anyone, even if I didn't know who I was off of it. She smiled to herself. I don't think I've said that out loud in 20 years. We spent over an hour going through that box. She'd pick something up, laugh, or sigh, or just stare, then put it down again. Some things she remembered vividly. Others surprised, her like finding old evidence of a version of herself she had forgotten. She ever was. She read a few lines from one of her journals out loud, then immediately winced and shook her head. God, I was so dramatic, she said. Everything felt like the end of the world back then. So it was your whole world, I said. Back then, it's all you knew. She paused at that, then nodded slowly. Yeah, she said. Yeah, I guess it was. There's something sacred about being trusted with someone's past, not the curated version they share at dinner parties, but the raw, unfiltered fragments tucked into boxes and sealed away. Diane didn't just let me into her home that day. She let me into the spaces of her that she hadn't even dusted off for herself in years. And I handled it all the only way you should, with quiet reverence. When we finished, she didn't pack the box back up. Instead, she left it open on the side table, like it had earned its right to be seen again. I think I needed to remember who I was before I became someone else, she said.
Ow.
Before I was wife. Before I was mom. Before I was widow. The word before hung in the room like the scent of something just extinguished, faint but undeniable. We didn't do much else that day. No chores, no rearranging. Just sat with what had been unpacked, not just from the box, but from her. She looked lighter afterward, not giddy or glowing, just ... less burdened. Like she'd finally put down something she'd been unknowingly carrying on her back for years. As I left, she stood in the doorway again, not waving, just watching. The blanket from that morning was still bunched up on the porch swing, and the thermos sat empty on the railing. I looked back one last time before getting into my truck, and she was still there. Arms crossed, chin lifted, eyes steady. For the first time, didn't feel like I was leaving someone who needed me. It felt like I was leaving someone who was. Finding herself again, it had been almost 2 months since the first day I knocked on her door. 8 weekends of sorting, lifting, sitting, and sometimes doing nothing at all. The kind of nothing that ends up meaning everything. And now, when I pulled into her driveway, there was no second guessing, no hesitation. Her home felt as familiar as my own keys in my pocket. Not because I belonged there, but because she had never made me feel like I didn't. That morning, the sky was low with clouds, heavy but not yet threatening rain. It cast a kind of silver tone over everything. House, the porch, even her hair, as she stood on the steps holding 2 mugs of coffee like it was tradition. And maybe by then, it was. She handed me one and said, "No project today, unless you count talking as work." There was something playful in her voice, but I could also tell she meant it. She needed space, not action. We sat inside the living room, already warm from the heater she'd turned on before I arrived. A blanket draped over the back of the couch, and the same candle from last time flickered on the side table. It smelled like cedar this time, rich and grounding. She curled up on one end of the couch, legs tucked under her, and I took the armchair across from her. There was a silence between us that didn't ask to be broken. Not awkward, not uncomfortable, just real. Eventually, she leaned her head against the cushion and said, "I had a dream last night." About Michael? Her voice wasn't shaken, just subdued, like she was watching the memory from a distance. We weren't doing anything special, just sitting at the kitchen table like always. He was wearing that same flannel shirt he wore too often, red and black checkered, torn at the elbow. "I remember thinking in the dream that I should tell him about you, that you'd been helping around the house. The garage was finally cleared." She paused for a second, looking past me into some invisible scene still playing behind her eyes. But before I could say anything, he just looked at me and said, "I'm glad you're not so alone anymore." Then he smiled and stood up and walked away. That was it. She blinked a few times, not crying, not dramatic, just present. With it, it wasn't sad. It wasn't joyful either. Just ... honest. That dream hung in the air for a while between us, I didn't reach for it. I let it be. Sometimes dreams are echoes, and sometimes they're letters from places we can't name. Either way, they deserve to be held gently. She sat with it, with me, with the memory, and eventually let out a slow breath that seemed to clear the fog from her chest. I think part of me needed his permission, she said after a long pause. Not that I was waiting for it, but maybe I was. Sat there for a long time without trying to fill the space. Outside, the wind began to stir the trees, rustling dried leaves against windows and gutters. It sounded like the world was exhaling, a shift in season, a shift in energy, and maybe even a shift in us. Later, we ended up in the kitchen again. She moved with more ease now, more presence. Not like she was putting on a show for a guest, but like she was just being herself again. And she pulled ingredients from cabinets without checking labels, dropped vegetables into a pot without measuring, laughed at herself when she spilled a little salt. I used to be a great cook, she said with a smirk. Then life happened, and takeout happened. And then grief showed up with its own menu. That kind of casual vulnerability was new. Not because she'd hidden before, but because she didn't seem to be carrying everything so tightly anymore. The armor she wore in those first few weeks had been softened by routine, by presence, by being allowed to unravel in small ways and still be met with acceptance. She handed me a spoon and said, "Taste this." I did. It was perfect. She rolled her eyes like she didn't believe me, then tasted it herself and laughed. Okay, not bad. Not bad at all. We ate at the table with the window open, the cold breeze mixing with the heat from the food, the contrast sharp but comforting. She talked about her daughter, how they'd texted more often lately, how she'd even sent a photo of a dog she was thinking about adopting. It's funny, Diane said, how letting go of one thing can make room for another, even the smallest things. She smiled as she spoke, not because of anything I said, but because she meant it. After lunch, she showed me a stack of books. She'd started reading old favorites, dusty covers, dog-eared pages. I forgot how much I love to read, she said, brushing her fingers along the spine of one of them. It feels like I'm visiting a version of myself I actually liked. There it was again, that idea. The self she had been, the self she was becoming, the space between. And maybe I was standing in that space with her now, not to replace anything, not to define it, just to witness it take shape. Before I left, she walked me to the door, but this time she stepped outside with me, the cold nipping at our sleeves. We stood there for a minute, not saying much, until finally she turned to me and said, "You know, I used to think healing would feel like a breakthrough. It's like one big moment where everything made sense again. And now," she looked out at the yard, the wind catching a few stray leaves and tossing them across the sidewalk like confetti. "Oh, I think it feels more like this," she said. 100 small moments, quiet ones, cups of coffee, unopened boxes, listening. Showing up? I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I knew exactly what she meant. As I walked back to my truck, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not dramatic, not sudden, just a small, undeniable shift. Like maybe I wasn't just helping someone else heal, maybe I was healing too. By now, I had stopped thinking of my visits as helping Diane. That language had quietly fallen away. I wasn't a helper anymore. I wasn't there for a job. What we were building had outgrown that. Each Saturday became less about what we did and more about the space we shared while doing a tour, not doing anything at all. And I noticed how my weeks subtly began to orbit around those mornings. How everything between Sundays and Fridays felt. Like the space between chapters, waiting for the next page to turn. This particular morning, the house smelled like cinnamon and something else I couldn't quite place. Sapples, maybe, or cloves. Something warm, comforting. Diane opened the door before I even knocked, holding a folded dish towel in one hand and looking more relaxed than I'd ever seen her. Her hair was still damp from a shower, her sleeves rolled up like she was in the sturt. Middle of living, not performing hospitality. She smiled when she saw me. Not the small, guarded kind she used to offer, but something more open, more rooted. "I made pie," she said. I have no idea why. I just woke up and wanted to. We sat in the kitchen, the pie between us, steam still rising from the crust. It wasn't perfect. The edges were a little uneven. The filling had bubbled out in one spot, but that only made it more endearing. It's like something made without the pressure to impress. It's just made to be enjoyed. I complimented it genuinely, and she laughed in a way that told me she actually believed me this time. That hadn't always been the case. We talked about nothing for a while. The weather, news story she'd read, a stray cat that had taken, 2 sleeping under her hydrangeas. It was in that rhythm, in that gentle banter, that something shifted between us. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but enough to feel it. The kind of shift where the silences start to feel charged, where the line between comfort and something more starts to blur it because of words spoken or because of what's being held. Back, after the pie, we ended up in the den, a room I'd only seen briefly once before. It was smaller than the rest of the house, tucked in the back, with deep brown walls and a thick rug that muffled every step. A room designed for stillness. She sat on the floor beside the coffee table, flipping through an old album she hadn't touched in years. I joined her, sitting across from her, knees bent. Leaning forward, she passed the album across the table without speaking. I took it and slowly turned the pages. Pictures of her as a young woman, hair longer, eyes the same. Her and Michael at a wedding, holding their newborn daughter. The first house they ever bought. Summers at the lake, falls in the mountains. Little frozen moments of joy and chaos and everything in between. I used to think those were the best years of my life, she said after a long pause. And maybe they were. But lately I've started wondering, what if I still have good years ahead? What if joy doesn't only live in the rearview mirror? She said it like a question, but it wasn't. It was a quiet revelation. The kind you come to only after walking through enough empty rooms and sorting through enough memories to realize that you're still alive, even after everything you've lost. I handed the album back, and she didn't look at it again. Just closed the cover and set it aside, like it had done its job for the day. We stayed on the floor, backs against opposite ends of the couch, the weight of the afternoon settling gently around us. The sunlight slanted through the windows in long golden lines. There was no music, no sound beyond the occasional creak of the house adjusting to the hour. At one point, she turned to look at me. Really look. And there was something behind her. Eyes I hadn't seen before, not grief, not reflection, but presence. Vulnerability without apology. In that gaze, I felt the air between us pull tighter, like a string being drawn slowly back, tension humming in the quiet. Neither of us moved. Neither of us broke it. But it was there, undeniable, I keep. Thinking, she said finally, voice low, about how strange it is to feel seen again. Not watched, not checked on, but really seen. She tilted her head slightly, studying me. You have this way of listening that doesn't feel like waiting. It's rare. I didn't know how to respond. Not because I didn't want to, but because some moments are too delicate for language. They live better in eye contact and shared stillness, in the breath that sits between two people who aren't quite ready to cross the line, but aren't pretending it doesn't exist anymore either. We didn't speak again for the rest of the hour. Eventually, we got up from the floor, both moving slowly, like breaking the spell might scatter something sacred. She walked me to the door again, her hand brushing mine briefly when she opened it. It wasn't deliberate, but it wasn't accidental. Either, it was enough. Outside, the light had shifted, the sky streaked with amber and blue. I lingered on the porch a moment longer than usual. She didn't ask if I'd be back next week. She didn't have to. The next Saturday felt different. From the moment I woke up, it wasn't just the weather, though the morning had arrived with a kind of cold clarity that made everything feel sharper. It was the weight in my chest that I couldn't name something between anticipation and caution. Quiet awareness that the thing we'd been dancing around for weeks might finally step forward, even if neither of us was quite ready to call it by name. By the time I pulled up to her house, the sky had shifted into that soft gray that always made colors pop. Every fallen leaf on her lawn seemed brighter, more deliberate, like they'd been placed there one by one. She was already outside, raking. Near the front steps, bundled in a heavy cardigan and a scarf that trailed behind her as she moved. Her cheeks were flushed from the wind, her expression focused, and she didn't notice me right away. I stood for a moment watching her, not in the way you watch someone perform a task, but in the way you watch someone live. She looked settled, capable, beautiful, in that quiet kind of way that doesn't announce itself, but insists on being noticed. When she did look up, she smiled in that familiar way that had become our shared language. No words, just warmth. She set the rake aside and dusted her gloves against her jeans as I stepped up. "Thought I'd get ahead of the leaves before they bury the porch," she said. "But I don't think I'm winning." I offered to help, of course, not because I had to, but because showing up wasn't about offering. It was just what we did now. I grabbed the second rake leaning against the wall, and we worked in tandem, moving slowly but steadily, carving back some semblance of order from the seasonal chaos. The wind would undo some of it within the hour, but that didn't matter. It was never about the leaves. There was a rhythm to the work that gave us room to think, to breathe, and in that space, my thoughts started drifting more, freely toward her, toward me, toward whatever existed in the middle. I didn't know what. We were any more? I hadn't asked. She hadn't said. And maybe that was part of the magic. That neither of us had tried to define it too early, or wrap it in labels that would only limit something still unfolding. After about an hour, she set her rake down and said, "Tea." I nodded, and we went inside, brushing leaves off our sleeves, shaking off the cold. She moved to the kitchen, and I followed without thinking. Everything felt instinctual now. I grabbed 2 mugs while she boiled the water. We moved around each other like people who had done this dozens of times, because we sat at the dining table this time, across from each other, palms wrapped around steaming mugs. She leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, her scarf now draped loosely around her neck like she'd forgotten it was there. Her gaze was steady, thoughtful. "I've been thinking about something," she said, almost cautiously. "And I don't know if I should say it." I didn't push. I just waited. She exhaled, long and slow. "I don't think I expected to care about you, not like this. Thought you were just a kind stranger doing a job, but now ... She paused, searching for the words. "Now I look forward to Saturdays like they're the only part of the week that feels real." I didn't move. I didn't speak. Because something in me had been waiting for her to say it first. Not out of pride, but out of respect. I knew her timeline mattered more than mine. I knew that for her to admit this, it meant crossing a bridge she hadn't even realized she'd built. "I'm not trying to rush anything," she added quickly, eyes flicking down to her mug. I just needed to say it out loud, so it didn't stay stuck in my chest. It took a few seconds before I realized I was holding my breath. I let it go slowly, steady in my voice. "You're not the only one who feels that way." She looked up again then, and there it was, something unmistakable in her expression. Relief. Maybe even gratitude. Not because I returned the feeling, but because I didn't run from it. We didn't talk about it any further that day. We didn't need to. The words had been said, and that was enough. We spent the rest of the afternoon quietly. She read from a book on the couch while I patched a loose board on the back steps. Later, we ate leftovers, something simple she'd reheated, served without fuss. The comfort between us had deepened. It no longer needed tending. It just was. When it was time to leave, we lingered at the doorway longer than usual. The wind had picked up again, carrying the last of the golden leaves across the street in twirling arcs. She stood close, arms folded, her shoulder just barely touching my arm. There was a warmth in that small connection, careful, not a touch born of impulse, but one shaped by trust. "I'm glad you came," she said softly. "I always am," I replied. And for the first time, I didn't walk away immediately. I stood there a moment longer, the door behind her slightly ajar, the porch light casting a soft halo around her frame. She didn't invite me in again. I didn't ask to stay. But the space between us had changed. Not fully defined, not acted on, but acknowledged. And sometimes that's more intimate than anything else could be. As I got in the truck and started the engine, I looked back once more. She was still standing there, hand on the door frame, watching me leave with a look that didn't ask questions but answered one I hadn't even said aloud. Something had begun, not loudly, not suddenly, fully. The following Saturday came with a softness in the air, a kind of stillness that always arrives just before winter makes its first real announcement. The leaves had mostly fallen by then. Bare branches scratched lazily at the sky, and the cold had settled in, not just as a visitor, but as a season. I pulled up to her house the way I always did, but there was something different in how it greeted me. The porch light was already on, even though it was still early afternoon. The curtains were drawn in a way that made the house feel tucked in. It was subtle, but I noticed when she opened the door, I saw it in her eyes immediately. She hadn't been crying, nothing that obvious, but something behind her gaze had sunk deeper. Something thoughtful, maybe even heavy. She stepped aside to let me in, without saying much, and I followed her into the living room where the fireplace crackled low, a new addition to our Saturdays. She had a blanket thrown over her shoulders and a half-drunk cup of tea on the coffee table. No pie this time. Music, just warmth. And quiet. "I didn't sleep well," she said after a while, curling up in the corner of the couch, knees pulled close.
"Not bad dreams.
Just ... restless." Her voice was calm but distant. Some nights are like that. The body's tired, but the memories aren't. I didn't speak, just sat in the armchair nearby and let her take the space she needed. There was something sacred about her stillness, about the way she was allowing herself to feel something without needing to cover it up. It wasn't grief like it had been in the beginning. This was something else. Reflection, maybe, a reckoning. After a few minutes, she turned her head and looked at me, not searching, not testing, just looking. You ever have those moments? Where you feel like you're in your life, but you're also watching it from a distance? She asked. Like you're present, but also somewhere else entirely. I nodded. I knew that feeling too well, the weight of it, the float of it, the surreal awareness that time is passing. But part of you still lives in another chapter. I had a moment like that this week, she continued. I was folding laundry, nothing special, just socks and towels on. Suddenly it hit me. This is my life now? No one to cook for, no one to clean up after. Just ... me. She paused and gave a small shrug. And for the first time, it didn't feel tragic, didn't feel empty. It just felt honest. It was the kind of truth that can only come from someone who's stared down the deepest kind of silence and lived. Asking for pity. She wasn't asking for a reaction. She was simply saying it aloud because it deserved to be said. And in that moment, I realized how rare it is to witness someone becoming whole again all at once, not in grand gestures, but in tiny acknowledgments of self. We sat there for the better part of an hour. I helped her throw another log on the fire. She brought out 2 mugs of coffee this time, hands steady as she placed one in front of me. The silence had weight, but not tension, just ... depth. I could feel the pull between us, not romantic in the cinematic sense, but real, tangible, like we were no longer navigating the same house, but the same internal map. Eventually, she spoke again. When you started coming here, I didn't realize how much of myself I'd locked away. I thought the house was the thing that needed clearing, but it was me. That admission hung there between us like steam rising from a mug, not for reaction. Just for release. I looked at her then, not just at her face, but at everything she carried, her strength, her sorrow, her presence, and I felt something stir in me that I hadn't allowed myself to name. It wasn't love, not exactly. It was the seed of it, the shape of it. A kind of quiet knowing that the person sitting across from me was not just healing, but inviting me into the process of it before I left. She walked me out onto the porch again, her slippers soft against the worn wooden steps. The sky was a dull gray now, and the wind cut a little sharper across the yard. She wrapped her arms around herself but didn't shiver, just stood there, grounded. I turned to say goodbye, to give the usual parting nod that had become our ritual, but she stopped me. "I don't want to go backward," she said, eyes steady on mine. "I've spent too long living in the rearview mirror. I want to move forward, but I don't know what that looks like yet." Her voice was clear, her words chosen, not out of fear, but out of care. I nodded slowly, matching her energy. "Don't have to know," I said. "You just have to not stop walking." She smiled, not wide, not dramatic. Just that kind of smile that lives in the eyes more than the mouth. And then, for the first time, she stepped forward, not quickly, not impulsively, and hugged me. It was brief, gentle, measured, but it was also full of history, of permission, trust, and when she pulled away, her eyes lingered just a moment longer than usual. Neither of us said, "See you next week." We didn't have to anymore. The next Saturday felt like a question waiting to be answered. It was in the air, in the rhythm of the wind, in the way the sky hovered low and undecided. As I drove over, I felt it pulsing beneath the quiet of the morning, that tension that only arrives after something important has been said but nothing has yet been done with it. Not discomfort, exactly. It's just an awareness that the ground beneath your feet has shifted and you haven't looked down yet to see where you've landed. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed her porch light was off for the first time in weeks. Not because she'd forgotten, but because she didn't need it anymore. I think that was her way of saying, "We're not in the dark now." She opened the door almost as soon as I stepped onto the path, wearing that same oversized cardigan from last week. Hair pulled back into something effortless, face bare, beautiful in a way only someone comfortable in their own home can be. There was something new in her posture, but real. She wasn't bracing for anything. She wasn't managing emotion. She was just there, present, and I felt the shift the second I stepped inside. The house no longer held its breath. It no longer echoed with things unsaid. It had settled into its own rhythm, and so had she. We sat at the kitchen table without needing to ask what the plan was. There wasn't one, no boxes, no garage, no attic, just 2 mugs of coffee and the quiet hum of a heater kicking on in the background. The kind of quiet that asks you to say what's been living just under the surface. She was the first to speak. "Been thinking a lot this week," she said, her fingers wrapped around the mug, eyes steady but softer than usual, "about what comes next, not just for the house, for me." She didn't elaborate right away, and I didn't push. I let her take her time, because the things that matter most often arrive slowly. "I spent so long anchored to the past," she continued, trying to preserve it, protect it. "Like if I let go of one memory, the rest would vanish too. No, I'm realizing something. The past doesn't need protecting. It's already done. It's already lived." She glanced up. "It's me who needs the room now." That landed heavier than she probably intended, and I felt it ripple through me. How many of us live like that, caring for shadows but neglecting the life we still have left to build? She wasn't mourning anymore. She was reawakening. It was terrifying and beautiful at the same time. "I've been thinking of selling the house," she said, just like that. "Not tomorrow, not even next month, but soon. I want something smaller, somewhere that's mine from the beginning, not filled with memories I'm always trying to balance." I didn't expect it. It's not because it didn't make sense, but because she said it with such calm certainty. No hesitation, no apology. "I want to travel," she added, "even just little trips. See the ocean again? Maybe take a pottery class somewhere? Ridiculous. Sleep in places where no one expects me to carry anything for them." That image settled into my chest like a warm ache. Her wandering, exploring, laughing, alive in a new way. A selfish part of me, the quiet one I rarely listened to, wondered. If that version of her included me, she must have felt the thought hanging between us, because she looked at me and said, "You've been a beautiful part of this chapter. I don't think I could have stepped into this next one without you." Her voice was sincere, not ceremonial. "But I don't want you to feel responsible for where I go next." It wasn't a rejection. It wasn't a warning. It was honesty, the kind that leaves you breathless because it's so rare. I leaned back in my chair, fingers tracing the rim of the coffee mug. I thought about the first time I walked through her door, how guarded she was, how every word felt like it had to push through layers of dust and distance. And now, here we were sitting in a house that had become something more than just a structure. It had become the womb of her rebirth. I'd been part of that. I don't feel responsible, I said finally. I just don't want to disappear when the story changes. She nodded, lips pressed together, then looked away for a moment. You won't. You're part of it now. Even if you're not in every chapter, that should have hurt. But it didn't. It was too real, too human. I didn't need to own her future to matter in it. We spent the rest of the afternoon walking the neighborhood. The cold was sharp, but we didn't rush. We stopped to look at holiday decorations going up on porches. Talked about nothing in particular, neighbors we hadn't met, dogs we wished we had. And beneath it all was the quiet hum of change. Something ending, something else just beginning. Back at the house, we lingered in the entryway longer than we needed to. I could tell she was waiting for something, maybe the right words. Maybe just the courage to speak them. And when they came, they were gentle. I'm not ready for anything big, she said, voice barely above a whisper. But I think I'm ready to feel something, small, with someone who understands how slow this needs to go. She didn't say you. Didn't need to. I stepped forward, not with answers, not with promises, but with presence. I took her hand, just held it. No pull, no pressure. And in that small gesture, something large unfolded between us. By the time I pulled into the driveway that Saturday, the wind had picked up. Winter had fully arrived now, not with snow, but with the kind of cold that made your breath visible and turned every sound sharper. Her house looked different, and not just because of the frost clinging to the edges of the window panes. There were little signs, holiday lights around the porch railing, a new wreath on the door, the scent of pine drifting faintly from inside when she let me in. She was already smiling when I stepped through the doorway, and it wasn't the tentative kind I remembered from the early weeks. This one was rooted, worn in, like it belonged to someone who had finally come back to herself. She was wearing a thick knit sweater and jeans, barefoot as usual despite the cold, and she moved through her space with ease, like the house was no longer something to survive, but something she'd chosen again. There were boxes in the living room, not the kind filled with grief, ones meant for giving. Books, kitchenware, a few old coats. She saw me notice them and said, I've been cleaning out with purpose this time. Things I don't use. Things that should find a second life somewhere else. She brushed her hands against her hips like she was shaking off dust. I think the house is finally breathing again. We didn't jump into a task. We didn't sit with coffee. Instead, we walked through the house together, room by room, not saying much. She'd point at something here or there, a lamp she might donate, a photo she was thinking of moving, a rug she'd decided she wanted to replace, and I'd nod. Not because I had input, but because I understood what she was really saying. This wasn't about aesthetics. It was about ownership. Every small change was her reclaiming space, not from her husband's memory, but from the idea that she couldn't change anything without losing everything. That illusion was gone now. What remained was choice. In the guest room, she paused, at the closet, and opened it slowly. Inside were a few old coats, mostly hers, but one I recognized from earlier, a heavy brown jacket that had belonged to Michael. She took it off the hanger and ran her fingers down the sleeve. I've held on to this longer than I needed to, she said, and I think I kept it for all the wrong reasons. It's not him. It's just ... fabric. She didn't cry. Didn't shake. She folded it carefully, placed it in one of the donation boxes, and closed the lid. That quiet moment hit harder than any breakdown ever could. Later, we sat on the couch again, the fire lit, our legs stretched out in opposite directions, a blanket thrown over both of us. The television was on, muted, playing some old movie neither of us recognized, but we weren't watching it. We were resting inside something else, a kind of silence that held us like arms. Neither of us had asked for more than what we had, and yet there was more there all the same. I could feel it in the way her knee touched mine beneath the blanket. I could feel it in the way she'd glance at me, not with question, but with confirmation. Like the answer had already arrived. She told me she'd booked a short trip. Just 3 days. Cabin a few hours away. Alone, no itinerary, no expectations, just time with herself. I want to know how I sit in stillness without needing anyone. Nearby to fill it, she said, not because I don't value company, but because I need to remember what I sound like when it's only me. I told her that made sense, that I respected it, that she deserved that kind of time, and I meant it. Even if a small part of me already felt the future rearranging in quiet ways, because that's what healing does. It creates motion. And sometimes, that motion moves people in directions you didn't plan for, but that doesn't mean they're going away. It just means they're becoming more of themselves. When I stood to leave, she walked me to the door like always. This time she reached for my hand, not with uncertainty, not with fear, but with clarity. Her fingers laced through mine and stayed there as we stood just inside the frame, the cold air leaking around the edges. She looked up at me, eyes steady, and said, "You've been part of the quietest, most important change of my life. And I want you to know whatever comes next, you mattered. You matter." I didn't say anything for a second. I let the words settle, the weight of them folding into the space between us like another blanket. Then I squeezed her hand, just once, and I said, "Whatever comes next, I'm still here." She smiled. Not the soft one, not the sad one, but the real one. The one that lived at the bottom of all the others. Then she let go. I walked out onto the porch, the wind catching the edge of my coat, the cold hitting harder now. But inside me, there was a warmth that didn't flinch. A kind of quiet certainty that comes when you've loved someone not by taking them, but by standing beside them as they choose themselves. And I knew then we were nearing the end of something, but not in the way that breaks. In the way that becomes. The next Saturday was the first in months that I didn't see her. Not because anything had gone wrong, but because she'd left for her trip the cabin she'd told me about, tucked away somewhere quiet, no cell service, no itinerary. I knew the exact date she'd be gone, but the absence still settled in. Heavier than I expected, the day felt strange without the routine of driving to her house, without the familiarity of her front steps, or the weight of a coffee mug passed across a table without a word. I tried to busy myself, filled the hours, with small errands, but nothing stuck. The stillness felt hollow. Not because I needed her to fill it, but because I'd grown used to meeting her in that stillness. And now I was alone with it. Sunday passed in the same quiet. Monday, I found myself rereading old texts, not searching for something specific. Just retracing the emotional trail, the breadcrumbs we'd both left for each other in moments we hadn't fully realized were significant. Her language had shifted over time. At first it was polite, distant, professional. Then it became casual, comfortable, and finally, in recent weeks it had softened into something unmistakably vulnerable. I didn't need the words I miss. You two appear. They lived in the spaces between what was said. She came back Tuesday night. And by Wednesday morning a message appeared on my phone. "I'd like to see you. If you're free." It didn't feel like a question. It felt like a welcome. And when I pulled into her driveway that afternoon, something in me clicked back into place. She opened the door before I even reached the porch. Her hair was pulled back, still damp from a shower. She wore a thick sweater, sleeves pushed to her elbows, a worn pair of jeans, and the expression of someone who had looked at herself in the mirror and decided not to edit anything she saw. I didn't plan anything. She said, "I just wanted to be near someone who knows the before and the after." We didn't talk much at first. She poured 2 glasses of wine instead of coffee, handed me one with a smile, and led me out to the back patio, where the cold had lost its edge just enough for us to sit wrapped in a blanket, shoulders touching beneath it. The sun was low and the sky, casting everything in that long golden hue that makes even familiar things look cinematic. We watched the wind move through the trees. We watched a squirrel dart along the fence line. We watched the light fade and the sky turn to charcoal. And then she spoke. The cabin was quiet, she said. Too quiet at first. Kept waiting for a noise to interrupt. A phone ringing, a car passing, even just the hum of another person in the house. But it never came. She took a sip of her wine, her gaze far off. I thought I'd be lonely. But somewhere in the silence, I found something else. I waited. I found myself talking, she said, out loud, to the air, to no one. And at first, it felt ridiculous. But then it started to feel like something I'd needed for years to hear myself, without apology, without audience. She turned toward me then, and I realized I'm not afraid of being alone anymore. I'm afraid of settling for being unseen. The words landed with a quiet weight. I understood them too well. That fear of blending into someone else's life, of becoming background, music instead of a voice. She wasn't sharing this to create distance. She was sharing it to define the kind of closeness she could finally accept. I want something real, she said. Not just comforting. Not just reliable. I want to build something that doesn't require me to shrink. I looked at her, the amber light catching her face, softening every edge that had once been hardened by loss. And I said without hesitation, "You won't have to shrink around me." That silence after the one where nothing needs to be added stretched between us like a promise. Not the kind you say aloud, it's the kind you keep. We finished the wine. We stayed out even after the sky turned fully dark. And when we finally went inside, the house felt warmer not because of the heater or the fire, but because she'd brought something back from that trip, something she'd left behind long ago, herself. Later in the living room, we sat on the floor instead of the couch. The blanket still wrapped around our legs, her head resting against my shoulder. We didn't touch. Beyond that, we didn't kiss. But I think in that moment, something deeper happened. We stopped orbiting around what we were afraid to name. We started moving forward, even if it was only by inches, as I stood to leave. She didn't walk me to the door. She didn't need to. Instead, she looked up from where she sat, legs crossed. Blanket pooled at her side and said, "Next time, bring a toothbrush." Not a demand, not an invitation to something rushed, just a breadcrumb toward the next chapter. I smiled, nodded once, and left without needing to say anything more. By the time the next Saturday came around, I had packed a toothbrush without hesitation. It's not because I assumed anything would happen. It's not because the meaning behind her words had promised some kind of transition. But because she'd asked hand, it felt right to show up with a quiet yes. It wasn't about possession or escalation. It was about presence, something consistent, something real. I didn't overthink it. I just tossed it in my bag alongside a fresh shirt and some old paperback I hadn't finished and made my way to her house like I had so many times before, but with something softer settling in my chest. She met me at the door like always. But this time there was no small talk, no preamble. Just a hug. Long, still, centered. She pulled me into the warmth of the hallway and held me in that space for a moment longer than usual. I felt something in her relax. Not collapse, not give up, but let go. What exactly? I wasn't sure, but I knew it had been heavy. We didn't talk about the trip again. Didn't talk about the past. The air between us had moved on. Even if the house still held faint echoes of the woman she'd been when I first arrived. The living room was rearranged. Again, not drastically, but intentionally. A new rug, a few different photos framed on the wall. The couch angled toward the fireplace now, instead of the TV. Little choices that told me she was designing a space she wanted to inhabit, not just one she was preserving. The blanket we'd shared on the patio last time was folded neatly over the back of a chair. Her books were stacked on the coffee table in a way that wasn't meant to impress, just meant to be used, lived with. We spent most of the afternoon in easy rhythm. Cooking together in her kitchen, nothing fancy, just a warm stew, garlic bread, a salad that barely made it to the plates. I chopped, she stirred. Our elbows brushed now and then, and we didn't pull away. There was no big conversation. Number 2, declarations. It's just small remarks about the ingredients, the smell of rosemary, a memory she had from her childhood about learning to bake with her grandmother. Her voice carried more ease now, more room for laughter in the pauses between memories. Not because she was escaping anything, but because she'd finally stopped carrying it like armor. We ate near the fire, plates balanced on our laps, socks curled under the edge of the blanket again. The flames cast soft light over the room, and for a while, we just listened to the quiet pop of the logs. There was nothing left to clear out now, no closets, no attic boxes, no emotional landmines waiting to go off. Everything between us had already been brought into the light. What was left was choice, and I could feel her beginning to choose. Not just me, but life. Fully. Without apology, she asked me to stay. Not with words, just a glance down the hallway. When the fire had faded to embers, a subtle lean toward the guest room, and then back to me again. I nodded, picked up my bag, and followed her down the hall, past old pictures and new silence. The room was clean, a fresh towel already folded, on the end of the bed. She'd thought about this, not in a rushed way, in a steady, considered way. I brushed my hand along the dresser as I walked in, took a deep breath, and set the toothbrush next to hers in the bathroom like it belonged. That night, we didn't sleep in the same bed, not because we weren't ready, but because something about having that small distance to rooms, 2 doors, heartbeats choosing to rest rather than collide felt more intimate than anything else would have. It was a kind of respect that no one had taught us, but both of us understood. Love doesn't always arrive with urgency. Sometimes it shows up in restraint. I lay there that night in a bed that wasn't mine, but felt like safety. The quiet of her house felt different now. Not hollow, not fragile, just quiet. A woman lived here, a whole woman. And I was not there to fill the space. I was just allowed to be part of it. In the morning, I woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of a song playing low from the kitchen. Something old, something soulful. I followed it, still barefoot, still half asleep, and found her standing at the stove with her back to me. The sun had returned. The windows glowed with it, lighting up the kitchen in soft gold. She turned when she heard my steps and smiled. That smile, the real one. The one that had started showing up more and more often. "You slept okay?" she asked, already pouring me a mug. "Better than I have in a long time," I said, taking the cup, our hands. Brushing in the exchange, we sat at the table together again, like we had so many times, but this time we were closer. Elbows touching, knees aligned under the table, no need for pretense or polite space, just presence. She told me about a dream she'd had, one with no ghosts, no memories, just water. The ocean, she said. Vast and calm and endless, I think. "I'm ready to see it again," she said. "In real life?" I looked at her then, and I knew. She wasn't just healed. She was ready. 2 weeks later, we stood at the edge of the ocean, not metaphorically, not in conversation, but in percent, 2 pairs of shoes in hand, bare feet sinking slowly into damp, cold sand. Wind rushing against our jackets and tossing her hair across her cheek as she smiled into the horizon. We didn't talk for the first few minutes. Didn't. Need to? The roar of the water did the speaking for us, filling the space with something bigger than memory, bigger than grief, bigger than any plan we could have made. The sky above was streaked with orange and deep blue, the sun beginning to fall behind the waves in slow, reverent motion. And there we were, 2 people who had once met beside a sagging fence in a half-packed room, now standing at the edge of something wide and uncertain and alive. She looked different out here. Not in her clothes or her posture, but in her energy. Her face had softened in ways that told me the weight she carried had reshaped itself, not vanished, but no longer cutting, like a stone made smooth by water. She turned to me with that same calm I'd come to recognize, the kind that didn't ask for anything, didn't hint or test or reach. It just was. It's like presence, made into a person. "I used to think the ocean would make me feel small," she said. "But now it just makes me feel ... available. Like the world isn't waiting to drown me anymore. It's just waiting for me to walk into it." She stepped forward as she spoke, just enough for the tide to wash over her feet. She didn't flinch at the cold. She didn't run from it. I followed, standing beside her as the waves pulled back and returned again. And again, like a heartbeat. Neither of us held hands. We didn't need to. That kind of connection doesn't always live in skin. Sometimes it lives in the rhythm of shared breath, shared silence, shared readiness. We walked the shore for an hour, maybe more, talking here, and there, pausing often. At one point, she picked up a shell and studied it like it might contain a story she hadn't heard yet. "Funny," she said, holding it out to me. "Something can be broken and still be beautiful enough to keep." I didn't respond with anything clever. I just nodded. Because what else is there to say when someone hands you the thesis of their healing in a single sentence? We went back to the little rental cottage we'd found just off the beach, small, quiet, with old wood floors that creaked in familiar ways and windows that let in too much moonlight. She made tea while I unpacked the groceries we'd brought. We moved like people who knew how to share space, not because we'd practiced it, but because we'd earned it. We didn't need roles. There was no performance. Just two people being themselves in the same place and finding that it worked. After dinner, we sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, knees touching. Steam rising from our mugs into the cold air. The stars were out in full, sharp and endless. Above a sand, she leaned her head against my shoulder. "It's quiet for a long time, you know," she said finally, when he died. "I thought that was the last chapter of anything real in my life. I thought everything after would just be passing time." She paused. "But now I think maybe this is the part where I stop surviving and start choosing." Her hand found mine. This time, no hesitation, no uncertainty. "I choose this," she said, "not because it fixes me, not because I need it, but because it feels good to choose something that fits." That line, "something that fits," stayed with me, because that's what it was. Not perfect, not planned, but fitting, like two pieces of a story that weren't meant to complete each other, but to continue together, on their own terms. That night, we shared the same bed for the first time. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't dramatic. It was gentle, considered. The culmination of weeks spent building something far more intimate than physicality. We didn't speak much. There were no declarations, no cinematic soundtrack. Just skin against skin, breath against breath, and the quiet recognition that we had finally stepped through the last door dash together in the morning. She was still there, coffee brewed while I stood barefoot at the back window watching the waves. She wrapped her arms around me from behind and rested her chin on my shoulder. We didn't talk about what was next. Didn't need to, because the next had already begun. Not with a proposal, not with a move-in date, but with two people choosing over and over again to stay near, to show up, to listen, to hold. Months would pass. Seasons would change. The house would eventually sell. She'd find something smaller, closer to the water. I'd be there not to carry her, not to fix her, but to walk beside her as she kept growing into herself. And every once in a while, we'd still come back to that beach, not to remember what was lost, but to honor what was found. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.